I'm so glad you're here, because we're about to dive into a truly mind-boggling piece of history. You know, we usually picture the First World War as this purely European thing, right? Just stuck in the mud of France and Belgium. But today, we're going to see how this localized European conflict violently exploded, literally, across the entire globe. Let's just jump right in.
Okay, I want you to put yourself in a very specific headspace for a second. Imagine you're a totally neutral observer back in 1915. You're just floating above the earth, watching this whole thing unfold. What exactly would you see? Well, initially, you just see a war contained right within European borders. But then, right before your eyes, you'd watch it violently spill over the edges of the continent in real time. It's like a fire jumping a trench. And to understand exactly why this massive global spillover happened, we've got to look at the very center of the conflict.
Section 1. The Great European Stalemate. This is the brutal reality that actually kicked off the whole domino effect. What's fascinating here is how those early days completely flipped everyone's understanding of what the war even was. Both sides almost immediately found themselves completely stuck, just a hard, unmoving stalemate on the Western Front. We're talking zero glorious cavalry charges, zero taking of territory. It just became this grinding war of attrition. Honestly, neither side actually wanted a long, grueling war, but, well, they were stalled in the mud. The only strategy left on the table was just wearing the other guy down. But how on earth do you win when literally neither side can move forward an inch? Simple. You get desperate. To break that deadlock, both sides started taking some massive, deeply desperate measures. The Allies realized they had a huge advantage. They could pull plenty of men from their overseas dominions. Meanwhile, the British set up a massive naval blockade to literally starve Germany, just completely cutting off their imported food and supplies. But the real game changer? Both sides started frantically searching for entirely new frontiers just to break the stalemate. The thinking was, hey, if we can't win going through the front door, we're going to smash through the back door.
Moving to Section 2, the world gets dragged in. This is exactly where our neutral observer starts to see the global map really light up. So this war was incredibly hungry for more combatants, and it started pulling in this massive, ever-expanding roster. The Allies made some new friends, including Italy, who, fun fact, actually switched sides because the Allies promised them a chunk of Austria-Hungary's territory. Then you had Japan. They were already busy building an empire and were more than happy to jump in just so they could snatch up German islands and colonies over in East Asia. Eventually, Portugal, Romania, and Greece jumped into the fray too. On the flip side, the Central Powers managed to bring in the Ottoman Empire, and they also promised Bulgaria basically its wildest territorial dreams to get them on board, totally playing on Bulgaria's bitterness from losing a recent Balkan war. Pretty much everyone had a motive, right? And this war was the perfect excuse to act on it.
But here's the real tragedy. The conflict just swallowed up places that had absolutely nothing to do with European politics. When the war broke out, Australia was super quick to seize German New Guinea. The Allies immediately jumped on Germany's colonies down in Africa. And in German East Africa specifically, locals were conscripted as soldiers and supply carriers by both sides. It led to a devastating, deeply tragic loss of life for native Africans. They were basically dragged into a meat grinder they had no part in starting. Section 3. Deserts, mountains, and seas. Because as the war expanded, it had to violently adapt to some wildly hostile terrains.
We really need to contrast these totally different worlds of combat. Over on the Western Front, it was all static mud, endless trench stalemates, and just horrifying bloody attrition at places like Verdun and the Somme. At the Somme, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the very first day alone. But out on these new frontiers, combat evolved into something bizarre and honestly just as deadly. We're talking freezing, sub-zero conditions up in the Caucasus Mountains, scorching heat in the deserts around the Suez Canal, and even standoffs out on the open oceans. Actually, speaking of the oceans, there's a wild detail here. Both sides had this shiny new, incredibly expensive class of battleship called the Dreadnought, but they were so completely terrified of actually losing them that they practically kept them hidden in port for almost the entire war. They brought them out for one big battle, got a little banged up, and pretty much said, nope, never doing that again.
Meanwhile, the Middle East turned into absolute chaos. A big reason? Britain desperately needed to secure the region's massive oil supplies. The Ottomans tried attacking Russia in the freezing Caucasus Mountains, but they just weren't prepared for the cold. So many of them tragically froze to death. Then they tried crossing miles of scorching desert to snatch the Suez Canal from the British. That failed too. The British weren't doing much better. They tried pushing up the Tigris River to take Baghdad, but their army got trapped and besieged at a town called Kut and eventually had to surrender. Finally, there was this all-out desert warfare offensive, heavily aided by a British officer you've probably heard of, Lawrence of Arabia. He wreaked total havoc on Ottoman supply lines by leading Arab tribes in revolt. Oh, and get this, Germany actually tried sending spies into Afghanistan to spark a jihad against the British in India, but the spies literally just got bored, brewed their own alcohol, got drunk, and the entire plan fell apart. You can't make this stuff up. But this chaotic expansion also had deeply horrifying consequences far away from the battlefield. 1,500,000. To put that into perspective, that is the devastating number of lives lost in the Armenian genocide. See, after the Ottomans suffered some really disastrous initial combat losses, they scapegoated the ethnic Armenians living right within their own borders. And that cruel blame shifting led directly to this unspeakable tragedy. This absolute level of desperation inevitably meant someone was going to shatter the rule book. Section 4. Breaking the rules. So here's a really crucial point. Before this war even started, there was an international conference that clearly set the rules for modern warfare. Stuff like absolutely no chemical weapons and strictly no killing civilians. Pretty standard, right? But the Germans knew the Allies had more men and more supplies. They desperately needed to break the stalemate. So they just threw the rules out the window. Step 1, they launched Zeppelin air raids over British cities. Step 2, they started attacking Allied trenches with deadly chlorine gas. And Step 3, they unleashed submarines to sink civilian ships. Now, if we go back to our neutral observer perspective for a second, it's really important to point out that the Allies soon started using chemical warfare themselves. Plus, they were actually hiding anti-submarine weapons on civilian ships, which gave the Germans the perfect excuse to justify their attacks. Basically, the so-called rules of war were just completely shattered by everyone involved. And that unrestricted submarine warfare brings us to a very specific, very tragic number, 159. That is the exact number of Americans who died when a German submarine sank a civilian ocean liner called the Lusitania. This single devastating event heavily swayed United States public opinion against the Germans. And, as you can guess, it completely set the stage for the final act of the war. Which brings us to Section 5. America tips the scales. The final act. By the time 1917 rolled around, all the original combatants were just running on fumes. I mean, they had reached a deeply desperate state of total exhaustion. Mutinies were actively breaking out across the French army. The German populace was literally starving in the streets thanks to that British naval blockade we talked about. And Russia? Well, Russia was completely drained. The people were sick of starving, and frankly, they were angry that, as the source hilariously points out, a crazy magic homeless guy was seemingly calling some of the shots at the palace. This sheer frustration sparked full-scale riots, leading to a revolution that violently overthrew the Tsar. Eventually, the Bolsheviks took over and just pulled Russia out of the war entirely. At this point, it was literally just a race to see who would break first. So, with Russia bowing out, Germany suddenly thought, hey, we actually have a chance here to focus entirely on the West. But the United States was still looming in the background. So Germany makes this incredibly fatal miscalculation. They send a secret telegram to Mexico, essentially asking, hey, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys just attacked America? Naturally, the British intercepted this message, marched right over and showed it to the Americans, and yep, that was the final straw. This created the ultimate resource shift. Up until now, America had just been selling supplies to the Allies all war long, getting super rich in the process. They were in fantastic shape. Now, compare that fresh energy to the Central Powers. They're starving, they're exhausted, and they're spending their absolute last drops of resources converging troops for these desperate final punches at the Somme. And sure, they pushed the Allies back with punch after punch, but the Allies were getting smarter and better at repelling them. And once the Allies were backed by this massive, flooded influx of fresh American troops and an incredibly wealthy U.S. economy, the Central Powers just had nothing left in the tank. The entire balance of power was completely shattered. What followed was a rapid, brutal, domino-like collapse under the sheer, overwhelming weight of the Allied counterattacks. First, Bulgaria collapses. Second, the Ottoman Empire falls. Third, Austria-Hungary crumbles. And finally, on November 11th, 1918, at exactly 11 o'clock, Germany surrenders. They were forced to drastically reduce their military, officially accept a guilt for starting the war, and foot the absolutely massive bill. Which leaves us with a pretty haunting reality. After all that indescribable global suffering, Tragic losses of life stretching from the muddy trenches of France all the way to the scorching deserts of the Middle East. After millions upon millions dead, the world learned its lesson. Everyone promised never, ever to have such an awful war again. But, as we know, that peace, it only lasted for about 20 years. It really makes you wonder, when the dominoes fall that hard, can you ever really put them back up the exact same way? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped you map out the true, terrifying global scale of the Great War. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will catch you next time.